590 square kilometers. That's how much ground Ukraine has clawed back in the south since the start of this year, and they did it without the armored columns everyone was waiting for. No masked tank assault, no breakthrough you'd recognize from any war film. And yet, Russia's grip on the corridor feeding Crimea is tightening into something it can't breathe through. The strange part: the corridor is still there, the trains still move. So how does a supply line die while it's still standing? That's the question Moscow doesn't want its own soldiers asking. To understand why that question terrifies Moscow, you have to understand what the corridor actually is. Look at a map of southern Ukraine and find the thin ribbon of land that runs along the coast of the Azov Sea. It starts near Rostov in Russia, slips through the ruins of Mariupol, threads past Berdyansk and Melitopol, and finally reaches across the narrow neck of land into Crimea. That ribbon is the land bridge. It is in the most literal sense the umbilical cord that keeps the peninsula alive. Crimea is often described as Russia's unsinkable aircraft carrier. It is the home of the Black Sea Fleet, the launch pad for missile strikes across the south, the trophy that Moscow seized in 2014 and built its entire southern war around. But a carrier needs to be fed. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, water, food. Fresh troops, all of it has to arrive from somewhere. A peninsula does not feed itself. It drinks supplies the way an engine drinks fuel constantly, and the moment the flow falters, everything downstream begins to seize. And there are only two ways in. The first is the Kerch Bridge, that long span across the strait that Vladimir Putin personally drove a truck across to open in a televised moment of triumph. It was meant to be permanent, untouchable, a symbol. It has been hit, repaired, and hit again, and it has never fully recovered its old capacity. A bridge that needs guarding is a bridge that has already been wounded. The second is the land corridor, the road, the rail line, the artery. For 2 years, it was Russia's quiet pride, proof that 2022 had bought something concrete, a physical seam stitching the peninsula to the mainland. In the summer of 2023, Ukraine tried to sever that artery with steel. It launched its long-awaited counteroffensive straight down the Orikhiv-Tokmak axis, aiming to drive south to the sea and cut the land bridge in half. Western tanks led the way. The world watched, expecting a breakthrough. Instead, the offensive crawled into the densest minefields in modern warfare under the rotors of Russian attack helicopters and stopped. The tanks burned. The maps barely moved. Critics declared the southern line unbreakable, and the lesson hardened into conventional wisdom. That was the lesson everyone took from 2023: you cannot cut the corridor by force. Now it is 2026, and Ukraine has returned to the very same ground, the same towns, the same fields, the same road to the Azov Sea that swallowed its offensive whole. But this time there is no armored fist. There are no tank columns idling at the start line. There is something else, entirely something quieter. And Russia has just said out loud what that something has done. Because this spring, for the first time, the Russian side stopped pretending the corridor was safe. Let's separate what is confirmed from what is hype, because the difference is the whole story. According to figures presented by President Zelensky in late May, Ukrainian forces have retaken roughly 590 square kilometers in the south. The key word there is cumulative. This is not the result of a single dramatic week. It is the sum of steady gains since the start of the year, concentrated around the Huliaipol and Oleksandrivka sector. Independent battlefield monitors, like Deep State, have tracked the advance settlement by settlement, and outlets such as the Kyiv Independent and Kyiv Post have reported the same trend. So when you see a thumbnail screaming about a lightning blitz, remember the real figure is impressive precisely because it accumulated quietly, not because it happened overnight. Slow gains are easy to dismiss. They are also the hardest kind to reverse. The more striking development came from the other side of the front. According to Ukrainian outlets citing Russian sources, including reporting aggregated by Global Security, Russian commentators have now conceded that the land corridor to Crimea sits under Ukrainian fire control. Some of them have started calling Crimea a logistics island. That is not Ukrainian propaganda. That is the Russian information space admitting in its own words that the artery is no longer theirs to use freely. Armies do not volunteer that kind of confession. When they do, it usually means the reality on the ground had already outrun the ability to hide it. Then there is Oleshki. According to local reporting from most.ks.u, a Ukraine's 34th Marine Brigade call sign Boris Fen used FPV drones to strike a Russian position at a moment of maximum vulnerability while it was refueling just as a fresh drone operator crew arrived. 15 Russian soldiers were reported killed in that single strike. It is a small action by the scale of the whole war, but it is a perfect snapshot of how this war is now being fought in the south: patient surveillance, Then a strike timed to the exact second the enemy is most exposed. The targeting is not random either. The Institute for the Study of War noted in mid-May that Ukrainian strikes were increasingly aimed at Russian drone control points, the nodes that let Russia see and shoot back. Hit the eyes, and the body goes blind. It is a deliberate campaign against the enemy's ability to perceive the battlefield at all. On the Ukrainian side of the ledger, the reporting emphasizes the role of airborne and assault formations across the Zaporizhia direction units, like the 95th, the 82nd, the 33rd, and the regiment that carries the name Da Vinci alongside mechanized brigades such as the 65th operating in the sector. I'm naming these with care because the exact role of each unit at each village is the kind of detail that gets distorted fastest in wartime. What the credible reporting agrees on is the shape of the force-light mobile drone heavy infantry rather than the armored sledgehammer of 2023. And all of this orbits around one unglamorous place, Tokmak. Before the war, Tokmak was a town of about 30,000 people. Russia captured it back in March of 2022, and it has held it ever since. But Tokmak is not just a town. It is a junction where the rail line running through Donetsk and Volnovakha meets the highways heading toward Melitopol and Berdyansk. Almost everything moving toward Crimea by land has to pass through or near this knot. Choke the knot, and you choke the South. Now here is where honesty matters, because the channels that get this wrong all get it wrong in the same place. Ukraine has not recaptured Tokmak. The corridor has not been physically cut. The map still shows that ribbon of land in Russian colors. And a senior Ukrainian commander has openly described what's happening as an operational-level success, not a grand strategic counteroffensive, not the collapse of the Southern Front. Euromaidan press carried exactly that framing from the Ukrainian side. The honest version is less explosive than the headline. It is also more dangerous for Russia, and I'll show you why. It's worth being clear-eyed about scale here because the neutral analysts are. Ukraine is not rolling toward the sea. The gains are measured in kilometers and villages, not provinces. Russia still holds the overwhelming majority of the territory it occupied, still has more men and more shells, and is still pressing hard elsewhere along the front. The southern story matters not because it is large, but because it has leveraged a modest amount of ground, translating into an outsized effect on a supply line that Russia cannot easily replace. That is the difference between a headline and a hinge. This is a hinge. Small motions at a hinge swing very large doors, but it is still a hinge, not the whole door, and anyone telling you the South has collapsed is selling you something. So, if nothing has physically changed on the map, why is Russia talking about an island that is the part the cameras can't show? And it's the part worth slowing down for. Fire control is not the same as cutting a road. This distinction is everything, and almost every loud channel collapses it into one word: don't. When a military cuts a supply line, it physically severs it. Troops stand on the road. The enemy cannot pass. That is what Ukraine tried and failed to do in 2023. Fire control is different. Fire control means that everything moving along that route is now within range of accurate, repeatable, observed fire. You do not stand on the road, you watch it. And the moment something valuable moves, you destroy it. Think about what that does to a supply line. The road is still there. The bridge is still there. But would you drive a fuel truck down it? Would you send a train of ammunition along a rail line knowing a drone is loitering overhead feeding coordinates to a gun crew 30 kilometers away? You would not. And if you do not, the road is dead. Not on the map. In function. A route nobody dares to use is no longer a supply line. It is a kill zone with asphalt. Militaries have a word for this: interdiction. You don't have to occupy a road to deny it. You only have to make the cost of using it unbearable. And the genius, the cruel, cheap genius of what Ukraine is doing is that interdiction used to require expensive aircraft and scarce missiles. Now it requires a camera and a quadcopter. Now look at how Ukraine built that kill zone. This is the engineering, and it is unromantic on purpose. The first ingredient is sight. According to Ukrainian reporting, the southern operation runs on near-daily commercial satellite imagery, combined with medium-range reconnaissance drones. Read that again: commercial satellite imagery, the kind a company sells. Layer that over a constant rotation of reconnaissance UAVs, and you get something armies spent the entire 20th century dreaming of: a near-continuous, near-real-time picture of where the enemy's vehicles, depots, and crews actually are. The fog of war doesn't lift completely, but it thins to a haze. The second ingredient is reach. Once you can see a target, you need something to hit it. FPV drones for the close work, loitering munitions for the medium range, HIMARS and tube artillery for the deeper logistics nodes. Notice what's missing from that list. None of it has to break through a minefield. None of it has to survive a helicopter gauntlet. None of it has to cross the open ground that killed the tanks. The munition flies over the problem instead of driving into it. And that is the heart of why 2026 is not 2023. In 2023, a tank had to survive everything to be useful. It had to cross the mines, dodge the helicopters, push through the artillery, and only then could it take ground. Survival was the whole problem. The defense was built to make survival impossible, and it worked. In 2026, the weapon does not need to survive. A drone that costs a few $100s trades itself for a fuel truck and calls that a bargain. It is supposed to die. Dying is its job. Sit with the economics because the economics are the war. A modern main battle tank costs millions. A loaded supply truck and its cargo are worth a fortune in a war of attrition. An FPV drone costs less than a used phone. When a few $100s can reliably erase tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of the enemy's logistics, you are not fighting a battle. You are running a machine that converts cheap things into the destruction of expensive things over and over every single day. No amount of armor fixes a cost ratio like that. You cannot armor your way out of arithmetic. There is a third ingredient, and Russia handed it over itself. According to reporting from Ukrainian outlets and ISW, Russian access to Starlink in the area was cut off from the 1st of February. That matters more than it sounds. Drone warfare is underneath the explosions. A coordination problem feeds handoffs, timing the constant chatter that lets a defender mass fire at the right place at the right moment. Strip away reliable connectivity, and the defender goes deaf. So picture the asymmetry at its sharpest. Ukraine's eyes are getting clearer by the month, and at the same time, Russia's nervous system in this sector got quieter. One side is learning to see in the dark, the other just lost a sense. Now stack the consequences because they compound. Russian troops took ground in the autumn of 2025. According to the Ukrainian account, they could not consolidate those gains because they could not even track where Ukrainian infantry were infiltrating through the gaps. This is the infiltration doctrine, and it is the quiet twin of the drone campaign. Forget the image of a wall of men charging. Picture small teams, a handful of soldiers, each moving on foot at night through seams in a thinly held line under a sky that belongs to someone else's cameras. You cannot reinforce a line when you cannot see your own front. You cannot plug a hole you cannot find. The defender ends up reacting to ghosts, and here is the squeeze that should keep Russian planners awake. If the land corridor becomes too dangerous to use freely, the supplies do not vanish. Crimea still needs to eat. So the flow has to go somewhere, and there is only one other door, the Kerch Bridge. The bridge that has already been struck, already been partially broken, already operating below its old capacity. Now imagine forcing the traffic that used to spread across an entire land corridor onto that single wounded span. You get a double bottleneck. Two arteries, one half clogged, one held under the knife. Squeeze one, and the pressure on the other rises. That is not a setback. That is a system being slowly starved through both of its mouths at once. And rail makes the trap worse, not better. A railway is the most efficient way to move the tonnage a peninsula like Crimea consumes fuel shells armor, the heavy things trucks can't carry enough of. But a railway is also rigid. It cannot reroute. It runs on fixed track through fixed junctions, and a junction like Tokmak is a single point that everything funnels through. Damage a road and traffic spreads out around it. Damage a rail line and the whole schedule jams. So the more Russia leans on rail to feed Crimea efficiently, the more it depends on a handful of choke points that a drone can watch around the clock. Efficiency and vulnerability turn out to be the same thing. Remember, too, that Crimea was always a needy fortress. It cannot supply its own water at scale. That was the whole reason Russia rushed to restore the canal from the mainland in 2022. It imports most of what it burns and most of what it eats. A self-sufficient island can shrug off a siege. Crimea is the opposite. A dense military base bolted onto a peninsula that has to be fed from outside every single day. Tighten the supply, and you don't just inconvenience a garrison. You start asking whether the fortress can pay its own bills. This is the mechanism the loud channels miss when they shout that Crimea has been cut. Crimea has not been cut. That is the whole point. It is being slowly suffocated through a route that still exists by a weapon that costs almost nothing, directed by people who never had to set foot on the road at all. A blockade you can see on a map is a thing you can rush to break. A blockade made of watching eyes and cheap drones has no front to assault. You cannot counterattack a sightline, and here is the part that should worry Moscow most long after this particular spring. This is not a one-off trick tied to one lucky stretch of front. It is a method. Cheap sensors, cheap strikes, expendable everything aimed not at the enemy's strongest point, but at the thin, irreplaceable seams of his logistics. What works against the Crimea corridor works against any corridor. Ukraine isn't just taking ground in the south, it is rehearsing a way of war that turns an opponent's own infrastructure into a liability. Every junction, every depot, every fuel column becomes a question: is it worth moving today under those eyes? When the answer is no, often enough, an army stops moving. And an army that stops moving stops winning. Pressure, not capture. Function, not territory. Cost, not heroics. That is the doctrine. And it is far harder to reverse than a line on a map because there is no line to take back. So, where does this go? Let me lay out the scenarios honestly, and then tell you where I'd put my bet. The first scenario is the slow strangulation. Ukraine sustains its fire pressure on the Tokmak node, keeps the satellites watching, keeps the drones flying, keeps the junction under threat without ever needing to storm it. Russian logistics drift onto the damaged Kerch bridge. The double bottleneck tightens. Crimea doesn't fall, and there's no dramatic flag raising. Instead, the peninsula simply becomes steadily more expensive, more fragile, more exhausting to hold month after grinding month. Garrisons go short, repairs lag, confidence erodes from the inside. The second scenario is the Russian counterpunch. Russia masses force at Huliapol, drives Ukrainian artillery and electronic warfare units back, and pushes the front far enough that the corridor slips out of effective fire range again. Distance is the cure for interdiction. If you can't reach the road, you can't kill the road. The island floats back to the mainland, and Moscow gets to exhale. The third scenario is simple exhaustion. Both sides grind down the line, barely moves the drones, and counter-drones cancel out, and the south settles into the same frozen attrition we've seen elsewhere along the front. Here's where I place my bet. The first scenario is the most likely, but only as long as one condition holds. Ukraine has to keep its fire dominance over the Tokmak corridor. The data suggests they currently have it cheap eyes, cheap strikes, and a Russian force that has lost a step in its ability to coordinate. As long as those three things hold together, the corridor stays functionally sick even while it looks perfectly healthy on the map. The peninsula keeps bleeding through a wound that doesn't show, but I owe you the exit conditions, the things that would prove this prediction wrong. There are two, and they're concrete, so you can check them yourself. The first is a successful Russian counterattack around Huliapol that pushes Ukrainian fires back out of range. If Russia regains enough ground to put distance between Ukrainian guns and the corridor, the road recovers, the strangulation eases, and this whole narrative collapses. Watch the Huliapol sector. If it moves Russia's way, my call is wrong. The second is the weather, and this one comes from the Ukrainian side itself. A Ukrainian commander with the call sign Perun has conceded that the operation rode on a weather window, and that as the dry, clear summer arrives, that window closes. Clear skies and hard ground expose the small, infiltrating groups that this whole approach depends on. If the summer strips away Ukraine's cover and initiative, the active moves stop, the pressure loosens, and the corridor breathes on its own. No Russian brilliance required, just the calendar. So this is not a prophecy about a date. I'm not going to tell you Tokmak falls by a certain month because the honest mechanism doesn't work that way. This is a prophecy about a process, and a process with two clearly marked off switches. Watch those switches. Here's the thing to watch for. If I'm right, you won't see Tokmak suddenly turn blue on the map. That's not how this ends. Instead, you'll see something quieter and stranger, more Russian convoys moving only at night, more supply runs rerouted toward the Kerch Bridge, more Russian voices using that word island as if it were just a fact of geography rather than the confession of a defeat that never appeared on any map. That's the signal. A corridor dying while it's still standing. So keep your eyes on the logistics, not the front line, because the front line will lie to you and the trucks will tell you the truth. If this is the kind of breakdown you want, the mechanism behind the headline, not just the headline, share this with someone who keeps getting told Crimea has already been cut, and subscribe so you never miss the next one.